The lock clicked before Tiana Rowe could reach her daughter's hospital bracelet. Cole Madsen's grip tightened on her forearm, where fabric would hide the pressure. The bathroom reeked of industrial cleaner, masking something older. No cameras, no windows. The ventilation fan masked voices every 40 seconds. But Tiana wasn't trying to escape. Her phone had been recording for 2 minutes. The text she sent before the door locked contained only 2 characters, a location pin and the word, now. The bathroom wasn't random. She had photographed identical camera blind spots in 6 states: Edmond, Stillwater, Denton County, Lawrence. Cole Madsen had done this before. To women who filed complaints and then disappeared into settlements with NDAs. One of them was found dead 2 years later in North Tulsa. Overdose, they said. Wrong prescription bottles. Drop a comment where you're watching from, and subscribe before someone you trust learns which rooms the cameras don't reach. Because Tiana is about to discover whether the federal file in Newark documenting everything will be opened or buried by the same institutions that enabled the pattern. The lock clicked. That was all Tiana Rowe heard before Cole Madsen's grip closed around her forearm, stopping her hand halfway to the thin hospital bracelet, still circling her wrist, the one with her daughter's name printed in faded blue ink from 3 months ago. She needed this job. Her daughter needed the insurance. Cole knew both of those things. The bathroom smelled like industrial lemon cleaner laid over something older, something that had settled into the grout years before. The fluorescent panel above the mirror buzzed. She kept her eyes on the tile seam running behind the sink, a hairline crack that had probably been there since the renovation. The one that turned this particular staff bathroom in the back hallway of Ember and Oak on North May Avenue into a space the security cameras had never quite reached. Cole didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Not in the 3 locations where Tiana had worked under him across Oklahoma County. Not in Edmond, where the complaints began. Not in Stillwater, where they multiplied into written warnings that referenced mistakes she could not remember making. His hand stayed firm on her sleeve, positioned precisely where fabric would hide the pressure. He spoke the way managers do when they have confused authority with immunity. The grievances dissolved under scrutiny, but they accumulated into something that felt like evidence. The door had no window. The ventilation fan cycled every 40 seconds, loud enough to mask conversation from the hallway beyond. Tiana's breathing remained controlled. Practice, not calm. Her fingers stayed flat against her hip, where the phone in her apron pocket had been recording since the moment he suggested they discuss her performance somewhere private. She had started recording 2 minutes ago. Cole didn't know that. What Cole Madsen did not see, because men like him rarely looked past their own certainty, was the faint tremor in her wrist that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with counting. 28 seconds since the lock engaged. 40 seconds since the last cycle of the fan. 1 minute and 14 seconds since she had sent the text that contained only a location pin and the word now to a number saved under a name that meant nothing to anyone scrolling through her contacts. Subscribe before you miss how silence becomes strategy. The bathroom had been chosen carefully, not by her, by a pattern she had come to recognize across county lines and shift rotations. An architectural blind spot that repeated itself in venues from Denton County, Texas, to a catering hall outside Lawrence, Kansas. Places where women worked alone in hallways that turned corners away from foot traffic. She had documented every single one. Cole's voice dropped lower. Not threat, negotiation. The tone of someone offering a solution that required only compliance. A shift rotation that would place her in closing duties without witnesses. Hours that would bleed past midnight when parking lots emptied and managers held the only keys. His thumb pressed slightly harder against the inside of her elbow, measuring resistance. Tiana understood with the clarity that comes in moments that reshape themselves into before and after that this conversation had been designed to end one of 2 ways. Neither involved her leaving this room with her employment intact, unless she agreed to terms that would follow her into every shift that came after. Then the footsteps stopped outside the door. The interruption arrived wrong, not as rescue, as disruption, the faint metallic click of a radio being unclipped rather than turned down. Cole's hand loosened by a fraction, his attention splitting for the first time since the lock had engaged. In that instant before the door handle turned, Tiana Rowe made the choice that would unravel more than just this moment. She stayed exactly where she was, silent. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is give someone powerful exactly enough rope to prove they were never planning to let go. The door opened without urgency. The man who stepped across the threshold looked at the room's geometry before he looked at the people inside it. Tiana saw the boots first, construction grade. Concrete dust, still caught in the treads, paired with dress slacks that didn't match the occasion. Then the hands. Knuckles carrying white scar tissue from impacts absorbed decades ago rather than recently. Victor Iannelli moved like someone accustomed to doorways that required assessment. His eyes tracked the mirror's angle, the locked door behind him, the ventilation grate, the distance between where Cole stood and where the exit would be if this became something that required one. He had driven in from Tulsa after a property meeting that stretched back through Claremore. Dinner unplanned. But the way he positioned himself suggested a man who had spent significant portions of his life calculating sightlines in confined spaces. He had been in rooms like this before, different contexts, worse stakes. Cole's grip on Tiana's arm slackened, confusion arriving before alarm. Victor did not speak. He did not move toward them. He simply stood with his back to the door, blocking the exit through presence rather than aggression. When Cole opened his mouth to ask who the hell he thought he was, the second figure entered, and the question dissolved. The woman wore a navy blazer, Muskogee County credentials clipped to her belt. Her phone was already raised, recording, the red indicator reflecting in the mirror Cole had positioned himself to avoid. Bryn Castellano had made the drive from the county administrative offices after receiving documentation 3 weeks earlier. This location, this manager, a pattern that required witnessing rather than reporting secondhand. Victor still had not intervened. That absence was louder than any confrontation could have been. He watched Cole the way someone watches an animal decide whether the trap is worth the bait, noting the moment the manager's confidence flickered and then stabilized. Searching for the narrative that would let him control this situation. Subscribe before you learn that the most terrifying people are the ones who never need to raise their voice. Cole released Tiana's arm entirely. Stepped back, his posture shifting from command to negotiation. When he addressed Bryn instead of Victor, asking if there was some kind of misunderstanding, his tone carried the assumption that institutional authority would recognize its own. Bryn did not lower her phone. She did not speak. She simply recorded with the dispassionate efficiency of someone who had learned that silence was more effective than questioning. That people like Cole Madsen filled quiet spaces with explanations that became evidence. Victor remained motionless. In the reflected light of the mirror, Tiana saw what Cole could not yet see. This moment had been designed not around rescue, around documentation. The bathroom's architectural blind spot had finally been turned against him. The people now standing inside it were not here to intervene. They were here to let it continue long enough to prove what it had always been. Cole's eyes moved between Victor and Bryn, recalculating. When his gaze finally landed back on Tiana, searching for confirmation that she was as surprised as he was, he found instead the faint tension at the corners of her mouth. The expression that arrives when someone has been counting seconds and waiting for a door to open at precisely the moment it finally does. The realization began there, spreading like cold water through the certainty that had carried him into this room. This had not been improvised. This had been anticipated. The bathroom in Oklahoma City was not the first time Tiana Rowe had stood in a room where the cameras stopped reaching. The recognition of that fact had arrived 6 months earlier in Edmond. In a supply closet behind a banquet kitchen where Cole Madsen had cornered her under the pretense of discussing inventory discrepancies that existed only in his version of the shift logs. She had left that encounter with a written warning for insubordination. The kind of documentation that followed employees across locations and made future complaints look like retaliation rather than pattern. It was only later, reviewing the building's security camera map at the end of a double shift, that she noticed the gap. The closet sat in a corridor that turned at an angle the surveillance system had never been upgraded to cover. That detail might have meant nothing, except she transferred 3 weeks later to a catering venue in Stillwater and found an identical architectural oversight. Same corridor angle, same camera gap, same isolation. The transfers had been presented as opportunities, temporary assignments to cover staffing shortages during high-volume events. But the shortages were never where Cole claimed they were. The venues shared more than just his oversight. Subscribe before you see how silence gets mistaken for consent. Each location carried the same careful omission, hallways that dead-ended away from foot traffic, storage rooms positioned between service areas, bathrooms installed during renovations that had somehow never made it onto the updated security grid. Tiana began photographing the camera placements. Not for any purpose she could have articulated at the time, just a compulsion to document what her instincts were insisting mattered. She didn't know why yet. She just knew she needed proof. The pattern extended beyond Oklahoma County. A private event space in Denton County, Texas, where the manager on duty mentioned Cole's name in connection with vendor contracts. Then a convention hall outside Lawrence in Johnson County, Kansas, where the staff bathroom in the loading dock area carried the same unsettling familiarity, same blind spot, same deliberate design. The complaints she filed went nowhere because they were designed to go nowhere, routed through internal systems that Cole had spent years learning to navigate. But Tiana had stopped expecting those channels to function the way they were supposed to function. Instead, she began forwarding copies to offices that existed outside the restaurant's hierarchy. Regulatory agencies in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, Cook County, Illinois. Places where vendor names appeared in procurement records, and Cole's recommendations carried weight that suggested connections deeper than a regional manager should possess. The warnings accumulated in her file, each one carefully worded to sound reasonable in isolation. A mosaic of small professional failures that would make any future accusation look like the complaints of someone who simply could not hold a job. Tiana was not trying to hold a job. She was trying to hold a thread, following it backward through transfer requests and shift rotations until the shape of something larger began to emerge. Something that required more than just her testimony to prove. The night Cole suggested they discuss her performance privately in the bathroom off North May Avenue, she had already sent the documentation, already confirmed the angles, already measured the distance between where she would stand and where the door would open. The fear was real. The tremor in her hands was real. But the surprise, when Victor and Bryn finally arrived, was not surprise at all. It was the recognition that some traps only work once you have let yourself be caught inside them long enough to show exactly how they were designed to function. Victor Iannelli had not entered the restaurant intending to witness a confrontation, but he had spent enough years understanding how power protects itself to recognize the architecture of institutional silence when he saw it. The text from Tiana, containing only a location pin and the word "now," had arrived while he was reviewing lease compliance documents in a hotel room off Interstate 44. The properties he managed stretched from Tulsa back through Missouri and into the Eastern Corridor, legitimate holdings acquired over the past 15 years through the kind of patient capital accumulation that asked few questions about where initial investments originated. His name appeared on incorporation papers filed in St. Louis County and Camden County, New Jersey, addresses that connected him to businesses his younger self had operated differently, back when the word family carried implications that extended beyond marriage, back when the methods for resolving disputes did not involve county officials with recording devices. He had left that world the way most people left it, not through dramatic exit, through gradual separation, replacing the infrastructure of coercion with the infrastructure of legitimate commerce, learning that the systems designed to punish organized crime were the same systems that could be turned against anyone once you understood which regulatory threads mattered. The knowledge had stayed with him. the understanding of how institutions protected certain people by pretending not to see certain patterns. When Tiana had first mentioned the transfers and the blind spots and the warnings that appeared in her file with clockwork precision, Victor had recognized the shape of something he had once helped construct from the other side. Subscribe before you understand that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who threaten violence, but the ones who know how to make you disappear using forms filed in triplicate. His properties in Claremore and Broken Arrow served as conduits now. Rental agreements and commercial leases that generated enough paper trail to explain why a man with his history might be meeting with compliance officers and attending county budget hearings. But the real value was in understanding which offices processed which documents, how long investigations took when they were filed in jurisdictions that had to coordinate across state lines. He had explained this to Tiana carefully, not as an offer of protection, as a description of terrain, showing her how the architecture of accountability worked when it was allowed to work, and the limitations of what could be accomplished when someone with Cole Madsen's kind of institutional cover decided that the rules applied differently to him than to the women who worked under his authority. The drive from Tulsa to Oklahoma City had taken 2 hours. Victor had spent most of it on the phone with Bryn Castellano, confirming that the documentation Tiana had forwarded 3 weeks earlier was sufficient to justify presence but not intervention, that the county's interest was in witnessing behavior that could support regulatory action rather than criminal charges that would require different thresholds of proof. He had not told Tiana he was coming. He had not needed to. The text she sent was confirmation that the moment had arrived. His role was not to rescue but to observe, to position himself where Cole Madsen would see him and begin the calculations that men like Cole always made when they realized the room had changed in ways they had not anticipated. Standing in that bathroom with his back to the door, Victor had done what he had learned to do decades ago in rooms where the stakes were higher and the consequences more immediate. He had watched. He had waited. He had let the silence do the work that violence never accomplished as permanently. Because the truth about power was that it feared documentation more than it feared confrontation. The men who had taught Victor that lesson were the same men who had eventually learned it, applied to them as well. The documentation Tiana had forwarded to regulatory offices in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and Cook County, Illinois, contained information she had not fully understood when she first compiled it. Vendor invoices and procurement approvals that seemed routine, until the same company names began appearing across locations separated by hundreds of miles and multiple state jurisdictions. Meridian Food Services held contracts in Edmond and Stillwater, but also in venues scattered through Denton County, Texas, and Lawrence, Kansas. Always approved by managers who reported through the same regional oversight structure that Cole Madsen occupied. The invoices were clean, the amounts reasonable, the relationships documented in ways that would pass cursory audit. But Tiana had noticed something. The women who questioned discrepancies in those contracts were the same women who received transfers to locations where the cameras stopped working in predictable places. The connection had become visible only after she started mapping it, drawing lines between complaints filed and positions eliminated, between vendor renewals and staff rotations that moved people just far enough from their original accusations to make follow-up impossible. In Delaware County, a compliance officer named Garrett Pruitt had been reviewing similar patterns tied to institutional food service contracts, cases where procurement processes seemed designed to reward vendors who asked fewer questions about why certain managers required specific architectural features in the facilities they operated. The thread reached back further than Tiana's employment, connected to a woman named Shanice Holloway, who had worked under Cole's supervision 4 years earlier in a catering operation outside Bartlesville, a woman who had filed complaints and then stopped filing them, who had accepted a settlement that included a non-disclosure agreement and a permanent exit from the industry. Shanice had not survived the silence. Subscribe before someone's compliance becomes their disappearance. She had been found 2 years later in a studio apartment in North Tulsa. The official cause of death listed as overdose. The prescription bottles near her body carried names that did not match hers. The circumstances raised questions no one with authority had chosen to pursue. Her mother still lived in Claremore, still asked why the investigation had closed so quickly, still wondered why the restaurant group that had employed her daughter had paid for the funeral without being asked. The documentation Tiana had compiled included references to Shanice's case, not because she had known to look for it, but because the same vendor names appeared in the procurement records from Bartlesville. The same architectural oversights existed in the facility where Shanice had worked her final shifts. Cole Madson's authority was not his own. It was borrowed from a structure that extended across state lines and through corporate entities that existed primarily on paper. Limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Illinois that held contracts worth millions and employed no one directly. The regional managers who protected him were protecting something larger than his behavior. The complaints that disappeared into internal review processes were not being ignored accidentally. They were being managed deliberately, filtered through systems designed to identify which accusations carried enough documentation to require action and which could be buried under procedural delays that outlasted the careers of the women who filed them. The bathroom in Oklahoma City had been chosen because it was supposed to be safe, a location where patterns could continue without consequence. But Tiana had understood that some patterns only become visible once enough people stand in the places where the cameras were never meant to reach. The documentation she had gathered was not about one manager in one city. It was about proving that the blind spots were intentional, that the people who built them had names attached to regulatory filings that could be subpoenaed once someone with authority decided to look. The recording Bryn Castellano captured in the bathroom on North May Avenue became something different once it existed in a county file system rather than as private documentation. The difference between evidence someone possessed and evidence an institution could no longer pretend not to see. The audio quality was clear enough to distinguish Cole Madson's voice from the ambient sound of the ventilation system. The video showed spatial relationships that matched exactly the architectural blind spots Tiana had documented in her earlier submissions to regulatory offices in Pennsylvania and Illinois. Within 48 hours of the incident, Garrett Pruitt in Delaware County received a notification. His open inquiry into Meridian Food Services procurement patterns now had corroborating documentation from an active investigation in Oklahoma. The status of his case file changed from preliminary review to coordinated interstate examination. The mechanisms that followed were not dramatic. No arrests were made. No press releases were issued. Instead, the restaurant group that employed Cole received a routine request from the Oklahoma State Department of Labor. Records related to staffing patterns and transfer protocols across all locations operating under regional management. A request that seemed administrative, until the deadline for compliance was set at 14 days rather than the standard 60. The records specified included internal disciplinary files and vendor contract approvals dating back 6 years. Subscribe before you see how institutional pressure moves slowly until it doesn't. In Cook County, a parallel request went out to Meridian Food Services. Documentation of facility assessments conducted prior to contract renewals. Specifically, the architectural reviews that would have identified surveillance gaps in buildings where their equipment was installed. Cole Madson learned about the Labor Department request 3 days after the bathroom incident. By then, the operational structure that had protected him was already fracturing in ways he could not see from his position inside it. The regional director who had dismissed Tiana's earlier complaints now needed to explain why those complaints had been marked as resolved without documented follow-up. The corporate legal team that had negotiated Shanice Holloway's settlement 4 years earlier was being asked to produce communications related to facility modifications made after her departure. The questions were procedural, phrased in the careful language of compliance review rather than criminal investigation. But the coordination between jurisdictions indicated that someone had assembled enough documentation to see patterns that individual complaints had failed to establish. Victor had explained this to Tiana in the parking lot after they left the restaurant, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had once operated on the other side of institutional oversight and understood that the most effective investigations were the ones that moved through bureaucratic channels rather than dramatic confrontations. The bathroom recording was not the evidence that would end Cole's career. It was the trigger that gave dormant files in 3 states the justification to become active inquiries. The vendor contracts, the procurement approvals, the architectural oversights, the transfer patterns. All of it had existed in separate filing systems, maintained by offices that rarely communicated across jurisdictional boundaries. The recording provided the nexus, the single incident that allowed investigators in Delaware County and Cook County and Oklahoma to reference the same case number and begin asking questions that required coordinated answers. Cole had built his authority on the assumption that complaints would remain isolated, that women like Tiana would be transferred before they could find each other, that the systems designed to protect employees would be too fragmented to assemble individual accusations into institutional pattern. But Tiana had not relied on those systems. She had documented the pattern herself. She had sent that documentation to the specific offices that had the jurisdiction and the motivation to act on it if someone gave them cause. The bathroom on North May Avenue had been that cause. Everything that followed was not rescue or revenge. It was consequence, delivered through the grinding machinery of regulatory compliance. The kind of accountability that did not require anyone to raise their voice because it arrived in certified letters that could not be dismissed with explanations or authority. The liquor license renewal for Ember and Oak came up for processing in Newcastle County, Delaware, where the parent corporation maintained its registration address in a business park outside Wilmington. The application that had been approved automatically for 8 consecutive years was flagged for additional review, pending clarification of management structure and compliance history. The delay was procedural, the kind of administrative hold that could be resolved with proper documentation. Except that the documentation requested included disciplinary records from Oklahoma locations and vendor relationships that crossed state lines. Materials that would take weeks to compile and longer to explain if anyone scrutinized them closely. The restaurant could operate without the renewal for 60 days before the current license expired. But the payment processing company that handled their credit card transactions received notification that accounts tied to the business entity were under regulatory review. Within a week, the holds on incoming revenue began creating cash flow problems that made payroll processing complicated. Cole Madsen did not disappear. He continued arriving for shifts, continued managing floor operations with the same authority he had always projected. But the confidence had acquired a brittleness that staff noticed in the way he checked his phone between service rushes and took calls in his office with the door closed longer than usual. The regional director stopped returning his messages promptly. The corporate attorney who had previously handled routine matters now required written summaries before agreeing to conference calls. Subscribe before you learn that power collapses quietly, one unreturned call at a time. The restaurant itself seemed unchanged to customers who made reservations and ordered from menus that still featured seasonal specials. But the kitchen staff noticed that vendor deliveries were arriving on modified schedules. The assistant managers were told to delay equipment repairs pending budget reviews that kept being postponed without explanation. The audit notice from the Oklahoma State Department of Labor arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by certified mail that required Cole's signature. By Friday afternoon, the restaurant group's corporate offices in Chicago had sent word that Ember and Oak would be closing temporarily for facilities assessment and administrative restructuring. The announcement was brief, distributed to staff through a memo that thanked them for their service and suggested they file for unemployment benefits while the situation was resolved. No timeline was given. No explanation was offered beyond vague references to compliance matters and operational review. The doors locked the following Monday. The for lease sign appeared in the window 2 weeks after that, professionally printed, posted without ceremony. The other locations Cole had managed received similar notifications at staggered intervals, closures that appeared unrelated unless someone was tracking the pattern across Oklahoma County and into neighboring jurisdictions. Staff who had worked under his oversight were offered transfers to properties outside the regional management structure. Relocations that came with the implicit understanding that accepting meant not asking questions about why their previous positions no longer existed. Tiana watched this unfold from a distance, receiving updates from former coworkers who texted in confusion about severance packages that included non-disparagement clauses and legal releases they were told were standard but felt like something else entirely. The consequences were real, but they were being absorbed by people who had nothing to do with Cole's behavior. The injustice of that distribution was not lost on anyone paying attention. The system was correcting itself, but correction and justice were not the same thing. The distinction mattered more than the paperwork acknowledged. Tiana Rowe left Oklahoma City on a Tuesday morning in late September, her daughter asleep in the passenger seat as the highway stretched north through towns she had worked in and would not work in again. The relief she expected to feel at putting distance between herself and the bathroom on North May Avenue never materialized in the way she had imagined it would. The exhaustion was not physical, though her body carried the weight of months spent counting seconds and photographing camera angles, documenting patterns while pretending everything was fine. It was the exhaustion that comes from being right too early. From understanding that the system had finally begun moving, but that the movement would take years to complete and would likely never reach the resolution that justified what it had cost to set in motion. The job near Peoria, Illinois, had been arranged through connections Victor maintained in legitimate property management. A morning shift at a small cafe that operated out of a renovated warehouse in the historic district. The location was strategic rather than random, positioned close enough to the federal compliance offices that processed interstate regulatory filings that Tiana could be available for depositions if they became necessary. Far enough from Oklahoma that former coworkers would not casually encounter her on their days off. The apartment was furnished, the lease short-term. The understanding was that this was not a destination but a waypoint, a place to exist while bureaucratic machinery ground through documentation and determined what consequences, if any, would follow the pattern she had exposed. She avoided news updates deliberately, not because she did not care about the outcome, but because checking would not accelerate it. The waiting was easier when she did not refresh search results every hour, looking for developments that might not arrive for months. Her daughter adjusted faster than Tiana did, finding routines in the new school, making friends with the ease of someone too young to understand that stability was provisional. Subscribe before someone's courage becomes their isolation. The text arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early November, 3 weeks after the cafe had begun feeling less temporary and more like something she might be able to sustain. The number was blocked. The message brief. The content was exactly what she had been afraid to hope for. Notification that the coordinated filing between Delaware County, Cook County, and Oklahoma regulatory offices had been submitted to federal review. Preliminary findings supported further investigation into procurement fraud and institutional negligence across multiple jurisdictions. Tiana read the message twice. Sitting in her car outside the cafe after her shift ended, she felt something that might have been relief if it had not been accompanied by the understanding that submitted did not mean resolved. That federal review could take years, that the decision to pursue charges would depend on factors she could not control or predict. But for the first time since leaving Oklahoma, the uncertainty felt less like abandonment and more like progress, the difference between silence and delay. She allowed herself the small luxury of believing that what she had documented might actually matter in ways that extended beyond her own survival. The hope lasted through the evening, through dinner with her daughter and the routines that had replaced the hypervigilance of months spent waiting for doors to lock behind her. It lasted until the following morning, When Victor called with the news that would reframe everything she thought she understood about how institutional accountability worked, when the institutions themselves decided they had more to lose than to gain by letting the truth finish what it had started. The federal office in Newark, New Jersey, that processed coordinated regulatory violations across multiple state jurisdictions, maintained filing systems that operated on timelines measured in quarters rather than weeks. The document Victor called about existed in a status category that meant it had been reviewed but not acted upon, acknowledged but not prioritized. Assigned a case number that indicated someone with authority had determined it contained sufficient evidence to warrant further investigation, but insufficient urgency to bypass the procedural delays that protected institutional interests from hasty decisions. The file connected procurement fraud in Delaware and Illinois to management practices in Oklahoma, drawing lines between vendor contracts and architectural oversights and transfer patterns that had allowed men like Cole Madsen to operate with impunity across jurisdictional boundaries. The preliminary findings supported charges that would implicate not just individual managers, but the corporate entities that had structured their operations to diffuse accountability. Victor had learned about the delay through contacts he maintained in legitimate compliance circles. People who understood that his interest in regulatory processes was professional rather than criminal, but who also remembered that his past made him someone worth keeping informed when files that should have moved forward instead remained stationary. The request for postponement had come from attorneys representing the restaurant group's parent corporation, filed through channels that allowed them to argue that additional time was needed to compile responsive documentation, that the coordination between state agencies had created confusion about which records were being requested. That proceeding without allowing proper review would prejudice their client's ability to mount adequate defense. The arguments were standard, phrased in language designed to sound reasonable. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case had granted a 90-day extension while the corporation's legal team prepared materials that everyone involved understood would be used primarily to identify which witnesses could be pressured into modifying their statements. Subscribe before the system decides which silence to protect. Tiana had listened to Victor explain this on the phone, standing in her kitchen in Peoria while her daughter watched cartoons in the next room. The hope from the previous day had transformed into something harder and colder. The understanding that the machinery she had trusted to grind forward was also capable of grinding to a halt when the people it threatened possessed resources sufficient to make delay profitable. The file in Newark contained everything she had documented, every pattern she had traced, every architectural blind spot and vendor connection and transfer record that proved Cole's behavior was not isolated but systematic, enabled by structures designed to protect men in positions of authority from the consequences of using that authority to harm the women who worked beneath them. But documentation was not the same as decision. Decision was not the same as action. The gap between those stages was where accountability went to die if the institutions responsible for enforcing it determined that protecting themselves mattered more than protecting the people they were supposed to serve. The 90-day delay could become a 180-day delay, could stretch into requests for additional information and jurisdictional clarifications and procedural reviews that consumed years, while the corporations involved restructured their operations and settled individual claims with non-disclosure agreements that prevented patterns from ever being established in ways that courtrooms could recognize. Victor had seen this happen before, back when he operated on the other side of institutional oversight. He understood that Tiana's choice to document and report had created a file that existed in federal systems, but that the existence of the file did not guarantee it would ever be opened in ways that mattered. The conversation ended with Victor promising to monitor the situation and Tiana promising to be available if depositions were scheduled. Both of them understanding that promises about bureaucratic timelines were aspirational rather than binding. The file would wait because files always waited when the people they threatened possessed the resources to make waiting preferable to resolution. The question that remained was whether the truth Tiana had assembled would outlast the institutional reluctance to acknowledge what that truth revealed about systems that claimed to protect, but too often just protected themselves. The bathroom on North May Avenue still existed, though the restaurant that surrounded it had been gutted. The for lease sign in the window had weathered through one winter and into the following spring without generating serious inquiries from potential tenants. The tile remained. The ventilation system continued cycling every 40 seconds. The architectural blind spot that had made the room useful for men like Cole Madsen persisted in the blueprints filed with Oklahoma County building permits. A gap that would likely survive into whatever business eventually occupied the space, because renovations cost money, and cameras pointing at staff bathrooms raised questions that property managers preferred not to answer. The room had not changed, but the meaning of what happened inside it had expanded beyond the four walls and the locked door, becoming something larger than an incident between a manager and an employee, transforming into documentation that existed in filing systems across state lines and waited in federal offices for decisions that might never arrive. Tiana understood now, in ways she had not fully grasped when Victor first explained how institutional accountability worked, that the story had never been about rescue. It had been about who controlled the silence. About whether the people who built structures that protected predators could be forced to acknowledge what those structures enabled. The answer remained uncertain because the machinery designed to enforce accountability was also designed to protect itself from scrutiny that threatened its own legitimacy. The file in Newark represented years of her life, compressed into documentation. Every transfer and complaint and photographed camera angle transformed into evidence that proved patterns existed. But evidence and consequence occupied different territories. The distance between them was measured in procedural delays and legal motions and institutional calculations about which truths were affordable to acknowledge. She had returned to work in Peoria, resumed the routines that passed for normal life, stopped checking for updates because the waiting was easier when she accepted that resolution might not arrive in her lifetime, or might arrive in forms so diluted by compromise that justice would be unrecognizable. Subscribe before you forget that the most dangerous silence is the one that comes after someone speaks. Her daughter grew older. The hospital bracelet had been replaced by a medical alert card that fit in a wallet. The months accumulated into something that resembled stability, even though Tiana knew that stability built on unresolved truth was provisional at best. Victor called occasionally. Updates that confirmed the file remained in review status, that extensions had been granted and then extended further, that the corporations involved were settling individual claims with agreements that prevented patterns from being established in courtrooms. Cole Madsen had not disappeared. He had resurfaced managing a small restaurant group in Springfield, Missouri, operating under different corporate structures, but with access to the same architectural oversights and the same institutional protection that had enabled him before. Because systems that refused to acknowledge their failures did not prevent those failures from repeating. The bathroom in Oklahoma City was empty now, but others existed in buildings across state lines. Rooms where cameras stopped reaching and doors locked from the inside. Places where the silence would continue until enough people understood that documentation was only the beginning. That the real work was making institutions choose accountability over self-preservation, even when that choice cost them more than they wanted to pay. The file in Newark had not been opened. The decision had not been made. The truth was still waiting. Whether it would ever matter depended on forces beyond Tiana's control, on prosecutors who had to weigh career advancement against moral obligation, on corporations that calculated settlements in terms of liability rather than harm, on systems that had been designed by people who understood that justice delayed was often justice denied. This was not the ending anyone wanted, but it was the ending that existed, unresolved and unfinished. A story that continued in filing cabinets and delayed depositions and women who would encounter men like Cole in rooms where the cameras stopped working. The only question that mattered was whether anyone watching now would remember that silence, once broken, required vigilance to prevent it from sealing itself shut again.